Alrighty, guys, it looks like the rise and fall of Matthew Walsh has won. I don't know if it's really the rise and fall. It's a video by Jose called How the Talentless Matt Walsh Became Popular. I'm curious. So let's get this party started.
Walsh is...
Whoa! His voice changed.
Matt Walsh is not an interesting guy. His talking points are poorly evidenced and infantile. His delivery is flat and lacking in charisma. And the subjects he covers reveal an embarrassingly narrow perspective of the world. But he is incredibly lucky, and that's the secret to his success. Matt Walsh matters insofar
I think that part of the success of Matt Walsh is that he very confidently states things, and he somehow does it very hatefully as well. And I guess he's received some punishment. You know, like you've seen time and time again, Ben Shapiro seems to have no problem being monetized, despite the fact that he'll say things that are like anti-trans. But Matt Walsh somehow takes it to like the next level, and still hasn't, and like he got punished for it. You know, and listen, you have your perspective on whatever you want, but I think, you know, you should be respectful. But I think that intensity is one of the things that appeal to people as well, because he is so hateful in his anti-trans perspective, and I think that appeals to a lot of people on the internet who want to bully people, who want to hurt people or harm people in some capacity, and do mean bad things. I know that sounds kind of silly and cringe, but it's the reality. That's where cancel culture comes from. That's where virtue bullying comes from. It comes from this idea of seeing something that you perceive as a negative and sensationalizing it to the point where you feel that it's worth attacking and dehumanizing and destroying people over, whether that is invalidating trans people or trying to ruin somebody's ability to get a job, or cancel them for pretty much anything that is associated with them. That's really where that comes from. So
serves as an object lesson on how right-wing media figures continuously push on the limits of acceptable discourse to drag society backwards into a regressive state that strips away the rights of people to create a religiously centered culture. This kind of extreme Christian conservatism has been going on for a long time, and it's important to continuously oppose. But Matt Walsh himself, he's mediocre at best. There are a lot of other people doing the same thing and often much better than he is, but why is he someone people suddenly have to care about? Let's do a quick rundown of this guy's history if you're not familiar with him. Originally a radio host in Delaware, Walsh bounced around from a few jobs, struggling to last for more than a year or two. He started a blog in 2012, eventually catching the attention of Glenn Beck's The Blaze in 2014. In 2017, he started writing for Ben Shapiro's The Daily Wire, and he got his own show, The Matt Walsh Show, in 2018. But it wasn't until 2022 that he really started catching people's eye, notably with his anti-trans movie, What is a Woman? As his biggest success by far, it would be weird not to mention it, but I'm not going to go too into depth on this particular movie because it's been thoroughly debunked by other people on YouTube. So if you want a detailed breakdown...
I find that interesting, though. It was quite a cultural phenomenon to talk about that Matt Walsh movie. It was something else. It was something else.
And I would recommend Jessie Gender's videos on the subject. She goes into great detail on why this movie is a load of propaganda. But we do at least have to address what kind of content he puts out there, so instead I'm going to take a look at what it's like to watch his show. The Matt Walsh Show has a basic formula. He has one story he speaks to for the first 15 to 20 minutes of the show, then a series of 5 headlines he gives a couple of minutes to, then he responds to viewer comments, and finally one last story to cap off the episode.
I'm writing this down. I guess we obviously really couldn't move forward with this video or this conversation without talking about like the question of like what is a woman, because that's a question that is asked a lot by conservatives, and the answer has been stated pretty well. A woman is anybody who genuinely identifies as a woman and genuinely expresses themselves as a woman to society based on that society's like socially constructed idea of like what a woman is, and those are generally associations with different roles that they might conduct, or different ways that they might dress, which is ever shifting, and especially in more Western countries is very like free. And for a lot of people, that's too abstract to be like, oh, that's silly, that's stupid. I think that's too abstract and that's not good. And I get it, but like it fits the mold, right? Trans women that are genuinely identifying as women and expressing themselves as women are women, and cis women do the same thing. They genuinely identify, they genuinely express. I know a lot of it is like, no, it's about your biology, what's between your legs. But the thing is that like, that's not how we interact with each other in the real world. We don't pull down each other's pants and go like, well, what's going on here? For me, gender is just almost like a philosophical thing that we've been having conversations about forever. We've always been talking about what does it mean to be a real man? What does it mean to be a real woman? In the sense of like, what are the responsibilities and duties of a person supposed to be? We are obviously more than animals. And so like our personal identity and structure in that capacity is more important than like just having sex, because we are a lot more than just like those basic biological functions. We are very unique creatures and individuals that have a lot to say, a lot to feel, and a lot to think. And even the dumbest human being is mostly smarter than the animals. Okay, it's true. So it's it's a little more complicated than like baby or not, because I'm not checking your genitalia. I think that people like Blair White and Bailey J belong in the women's restroom. I think that people like Buck Angel belong in the men's restroom, right? It's a lot there. It's a new conversation. I get the uncomfortable feeling around it, but I also can understand the unique and incredible amount of distress associated with your gender not matching your sex. And for people that have gender dysphoria, I can understand how deeply distressing it is. So I can understand people wanting to identify different ways, having a mixture of gender dysphoria and a gender euphoria. And that's really what it comes down to, is like that basic human empathy for somebody else that's going through like a struggle that they were most likely born with and struggle with. And I don't think it's a big deal as a society to say, let's try to help like people with whatever they have, whether it is gender dysphoria or anything else. You know, maybe you're born with one leg. We should, as a society, be accommodating to that. Maybe you're born with like an intellectual disability. We should be accommodating of that. Not in a way that it invalidates individuals that have these particular issues, but in a way that is like constructive and helpful to get that person to function in society and be happy. Because I think that happiness is very important. And for some reason, I feel like we don't care about happiness from a societal perspective, even though it's very important. So yeah. You know, obviously female is different from woman. One is gender, one is sex. What is it, 2 X's? Women are born with 2 X's? Women are born with 2 XX, right? Is it XX and then XY is men? Yeah, so. But that's biological, right? So you would say like assigned female or assigned male at birth is like the new way to say it. It's a little weird to me, but whatever. Anyway.
Although it's segmented to give the show the appearance of variety, the only real difference is the length of each segment, as pretty much all of it is just Walsh commenting on a piece of news or another commentary. The first thing I noticed while watching is that, even for the big stories up front, Matt Walsh very rarely goes into detail about any subject he's supposedly commenting on. This is particularly obvious when he discusses trans issues, something he typically touches on several times an episode.
Yeah,
in one episode from May 2nd.
I always say that's all conservatives really have. There's no conversation about healthcare or poverty. It's always just like trans bad, trying to ban gay marriage last year. It's always just like anti-LGBTQ shit.
In 2023, titled Princeton Professor Tries to Debunk Biology, Fails Hilariously, episode 1156, my god, he's done a lot of these, Walsh responds to an article published on the Scientific American website. For some context before we jump in, this article is titled, Here's Why Human Sex is Not Binary, Ova Don't Make a Woman, and Sperm Don't Make a Man, by
That's an interesting conversation. I mean, like, it's more than just like a binary in the more complicated aspects. We as human beings do want to categorize things, so generally you can categorize men and women. But even intersex is just a category. You could argue, we could have as a society decided to make intersex its own like category. Or rather, we could have just made it a third sex if we wanted to, but instead we've made it something that is considered to be an outlier. But we could have just been like, oh, there are 5 sexes. There's male, female, pseudo male, intersex, pseudo female, intersex. We could have made those sexes, but like we just didn't, because we classify things. There are things that exist inherently, and then there's our classification of those things. And so we could have said like, oh, intersex people are their own sex, but we didn't. We decided to be like, oh no, you should choose one. And then, you should have, the parents will usually choose one, and then you kind of move forward from there. And I'm not saying that's the wrong way to go. It's just an interesting conversation about the way that we as humans decide to categorize different things. And that's something of note.
Justin Fuentes, a professor of anthropology at Princeton University. This article is a response to how the emphasis is often placed on how people are assigned male or female at birth on the basis of whether they produce sperm or ova. He provides a few examples of people reducing sex to one of those two things, and then explains with more examples and commentary from various scientific sources how the many complications of human sex make it difficult to place it in a binary. Here's an excerpt from the article that sums it up well.
When someone states that, quote, an organism's sex is defined by the type of gamete, sperm, or ova it has the function of producing, unquote, and argues that legal and social policy should be, quote, rooted in properties of bodies, unquote, they are not really talking about gametes and sex biology. They are arguing for a specific political and discriminatory definition of what is quote-unquote natural and quote-unquote right for humans based on a false representation of biology.
And he gives several historical examples of what that discrimination has often looked like. It's a pretty good article that offers a primary for why sex shouldn't be understood as a binary and focuses on how sex is used by political actors to discriminate against others. Matt Walsh is not so kind in his assessment of the article. What's most noticeable in his analysis, though, is how shallow his reading of the article is. Here's how he starts his segment.
Starting at the top of the article, it says, there are those politicians, pundits, and even a few scientists who maintain that whether our bodies make ova or sperm are all we need to know about sex. We already see the game that he's playing. The headline promises proof that human sex is not binary. This is a big promise, but then in the first sentence, Professor Fuentes sets himself up for a very different and much smaller task.
It's weird that Matt Walsh is calling the first sentence some kind of sleight of hand when it was clear what the article was about from the subheading, though that part of the article is never shown or read during this segment, just the broad headline up top. Kind of be like talking about the Star Wars movies without including their subheadings. It kind of is important to differentiate them and give you a little more context of what's being discussed, but instead we're getting context removed, so Matt Walsh can more easily make his point. You really get the impression he either hasn't read or is deliberately ignoring certain parts of this article. Here's some more evidence of that.
He announces his intention to respond to the claim that whether our bodies make ova or sperm are all we need to know about sex, except that, well, nobody ever said that ova and sperm are all we need to know about sex.
If you read the original Scientific American article, you can see he's linked several examples of people saying just that. Not that you have to go anywhere else, because you can see Walsh do a version of it himself less than a minute later.
Well, yeah, isn't that what conservatives tend to do that? I mean, I don't know, some of this language might be beyond me, but a lot of times you're boiled down to like your chromosomes or like your, I guess, biology in that capacity, and there's no room for like a conversation about gender. And I think that's all I think it's just talking about dispelling the notion that these aren't complicated things that we operate in when they are complicated. Like, I think that's pretty much it. It's like, hey, this is a complicated conversation about the different way that we categorize men and women and whatnot, and that's pretty much it.
Actually, it looks like to be disproving it. He's just adding on other details.
Okay.
But even if those other details are true, that wouldn't disprove the basic fact that there are only male and female gametes, which means that there are only two sexes, which means that sex is binary.
Right, but even there, like, yeah, maybe there are gametes that are associated with men and women, but then there are some people that are born with like what we would consider an incongruency because it falls with like outside of the normal. And the way, like I said, we decide to categorize that is interesting. It's just an interesting thing about the way that we as humans decide to categorize different ideas, right? And so this gets into a deep structure that we don't really necessarily have to worry about the massively nuanced complications of everything, because guess what, guys? Trans women are women, okay?
In the article, Professor Fuentes clarifies that when someone, like Matt Walsh, claims there are other factors, they never seem to explain anything beyond genitals and gametes. This video is just another case of that. We're told there are other factors, but never what those factors actually are. Seems like it would be a really good time to bring them up, but we just don't get them here. The segment is exhausting in that it's more or less Walsh going through the article, reading lengthy excerpts, and reacting to them. But each time he misses crucial context that would either change or complicate what he's trying to respond to. He'll complain that the article is just making empty assertions, apparently unaware that in the original you can see it links to many sources.
I think that in like the conversation with Hunter Avalon or the engagement with him, I really think we saw like probably one of the biggest, like most ignorant parts of like Matt Walsh, where he just doesn't really seem to have a lot of factual evidence when it comes to like trans people. He quotes out of context dated statistics and promotes like a conspiracy theory that the only reason that there is even a conversation about trans people is somehow to make more money out of them because it's a more profitable industry than it used to be, 50 years ago, which of course, because now there are more people, it's more accepted to be trans, so more people are getting treatment for being trans. But he makes it seem like there's some kind of a medical conspiracy to make more trans people to make more money, when the reality is that the reason why there's so much money to be made in any healthcare industry or any spot in the healthcare industry is because we have a really heavy for-profit healthcare system that's damaging like people, right? Like how many times you go to like the emergency room, it's cost you $250 just if it's covered, but just so that you can take a emergency transport vehicle. It costs $50, $20 or $30 for an Advil. It's insane how expensive things are, and that really just speaks to how expensive our healthcare system. And it all gets down to, my understanding is that this all kind of started when hospitals, like there was insurance providers, and the hospitals wanted to feel like they were getting a good deal. So the insurance, something to the effect of like the hospitals will charge a ton of money is basically what I'm getting at, and then but they'll provide a big discount to the insurance companies. So if you don't have insurance, you get completely fucked. And if you do, you're still kind of fucked because insurance is so expensive. My wife and I, she has insurance through her company, and it still costs us $600 a month just to have the two of us insured. And we have a $5,000 deductible that we have to reach. just before they'll start kicking in on doctor's visits and whatnot. It's a scam. Healthcare is a scam. It's fucking insane. This isn't specifically to trans people. It's a scam in general. So
from peer-reviewed journals. It actually assembles quite a bit of evidence to support each claim that's being made. Not that you could ever tell from the Walsh segment, since the excerpts are just displayed as text and you can't really tell they're linking to a lot of supporting information. Throughout this entire segment, Matt Walsh doesn't cite a single source. He just makes a vague allusion to the science. This is a pattern of his. The challenge in responding to so much of what Matt Walsh says is that he not only doesn't understand what he's responding to, whether that's deliberate or not, he also refuses to do any homework. If someone cites scientific research that counters his claim, he just doesn't acknowledge it. Walsh smugly argues at the end,
variations within a category do not invalidate the category. Males need to exist as a category in order for us to say anything about a male, a human male, such as human males are all different. They have different expressions.
This article is not arguing that categories within sex don't exist. Categories do exist within a spectrum. When a scientist says light is a spectrum, for instance, they're not saying that colors don't exist, just that the boundaries between colors are not so clear-cut as they would be in a binary. And Walsh doesn't even seem to understand the basic point of this article. It's not about upending some kind of scientific consensus that he's imagined. It's using established science to talk about how that science is politicized. And Matt Walsh is doing that politicizing in this very video. He's not engaging with any of the material in a meaningful sense, he's just twisting it to meet his own ends. This is what Walsh's content often boils down to, butchering evidence to make a hateful point. In the May 3rd, 2023 episode of his show, Mothers of Trans Kids Give Insane Reasons for Transitioning Their Children, episode 1157, we get all of that ignorance distilled into one of Matt Walsh's favorite rhetorical moves.
But we don't even need to talk about the science because it's also logically fallacious. It doesn't make any logical sense.
Of all the episodes I watched while
That's one interesting thing, man. I would hate to be a parent of a trans kid. Not because I don't like trans people, but like that's a hard struggle. Because you imagine your kid is born and they're born as like a boy. Let's say they're born as a boy, and then as they get older, they express it like that's not who they are. I feel like that's a really difficult thing for a parent to have to go through. The kid is obviously going through more, but as a parent, I think that the first thought, whether this is ignorant or not, is like, what did I do wrong? You know, and I doubt that there is anything that they did wrong. But then it's like, what do I do? Because you have this kid who's young, and they're unhappy fundamentally with who they are as a person because, you know, they're trans and they have gender dysphoria, and then you need to navigate that. And you also want to make sure you protect them, and you don't want them to make a decision they'll regret for the rest of their life. So to like weigh in on like why a parent's doing this, I don't think that there are any parents out there that are like, oh my God, I really want to have a trans kid. If there are, those people are bad. You shouldn't want to have it. Like you should just like, that's a struggle. I would never want my kid to be oppressed, and like being a trans is being oppressed, you know. It's an identity with an oppression. I don't want my kid to be oppressed, but, you know, but I don't think that any parents want their kids to be trans. They're just like, oh, I want my kid to be happy. And like, this is just a factor in their happiness. So I need to operate in the right capacity. So like, I wouldn't shit on parents for trying to just have their kids be happy and healthy, you know? That's what I think. I mean, that's just what a heavy thing to weigh in on. What are the ridiculous reasons he gives?
Searching this video, he never gets around to talking about the science. He would rather fixate on the simplified language of activists than actually dive into the science he's supposedly defending. And that's how he operates on most topics. In another episode, The Left Demands We Surrender Our Families and Communities to Violent Criminals, episode 1159, he describes a story where a trans man, Banco Brown, in San Francisco was shot and killed by armed security outside of Walgreens after Brown was suspected of shoplifting. Since no charges were filed and Brown was trans and black, and since this happened in San Francisco, Matt Walsh believes we don't need to look at the actual details of this case.
I'm confused.
As we know, the official legal bar for self-defense is set at a certain height, but the unofficial bar for self-defense against someone who belongs to 3 different victim classes is set significantly higher.
What?
And this security guard apparently cleared both the official bar and the unofficial bar, which is all we really need to know about the case.
He mentions 3 victim classes in this clip because he's also misgendering Brown. Actually,
I'm not understanding the point.
Banco Brown in San Francisco was shot and killed by armed security outside of Walgreens after Brown was suspected of shoplifting. Since no charges were filed and Brown was trans and black, and since this happened in San
so
Francisco,
confused, like what's happening in this part.
Violent criminal, most topics.
I'm just gonna...
In another episode, The Left Demands We Surrender Our Families and Communities to Violent Criminals, episode 1159. He describes a story where a trans man, Banco Brown, in San Francisco was shot and killed by armed security outside of Walgreens after Brown was suspected of shoplifting. Since no charges were filed and Brown was trans and black, and since this happened in San Francisco, Matt Walsh believes we don't need to look at the actual details of this case.
As we know, the official
So
legal-
a trans, I don't know why this is like so difficult for me to process in my stupid little baby brain, but it just sounds like what they're saying is that a trans person was shot for suspected shoplifting, but then there were no files charged against the person that was shot because they're dead. Like, am I misreading that? Like, why am I having so much trouble?
San Francisco was shot, episode 1159. He describes a story where a trans man, Banco Brown, in San Francisco was shot and killed by armed security outside of Walgreens after Brown was suspected of shoplifting. Since no charges were filed and Brown was trans and black, and since this happened in San Francisco, Matt Walsh believes we don't need to look at the actual details of this case.
I'm confused. Like, it just sounds like a trans person was shot that might have been shoplifting and no files were charged. So, like, what's the issue Matt Walsh has?
As we know, the official legal bar for self-defense is set at a certain height.
What?
But the unofficial bar for self-defense against someone who belongs to 3 different victim classes is set significantly higher.
What the fuck is he talking about?
And this security guard apparently cleared both the official bar and the unofficial bar.
Okay, is he saying that since no files were charged against the person who shot them, that it must have been extra validated? Okay, hold on. I'm trying to understand because this is a weird point. Then again, I think that the person making this video is not really showing us. It's quite a bit of what they're saying. Okay, this is what Matt Walsh, I think, is saying. Sorry, it took me like a second to comprehend. There was a trans person who was shot for allegedly shoplifting. There were no charges filed against the person. And since that person happened to be trans and black, I guess, socially, that means that they must be the security guard who shot them must be extra innocent, since they were able to clear the additional hurdle of shooting a person of color and a trans person. That's what it sounds like they're saying. So I think they're speaking to like the social idea of like when something happens to a black person, they get more social lenience. Well, I guess like if you looked at the Citibank Karen situation, like that would be the example where like there was an altercation between a white woman and a black young black man, and everybody instantly started with the black guy because the woman is white, and like racism, virtue bullies on the internet love to like for race bait everything. Is that? I guess that's what he's referring to. Okay, whatever.
Which is all we really need to know about the case.
I guess.
He mentions 3 victim classes in this clip because he's also misgendering Brown. Actually, looking at the details of this case reveals some interesting facts, such as Brown was alleged to have threatened to stab the security guard, yet no knife was recovered at the scene. And Walsh's commentary completely ignores the fact that this killing has raised an interesting question about armed security being used at a drugstore. We can see Walsh lie about this in real time as he describes the activists.
That's why activists in San Francisco are now calling for the abolition of security guards in response to this incident.
Activists aren't calling for the elimination of security guards, though. We can see that in the article Walsh himself is reading out. It's very explicit about it being armed security.
Yeah, they don't want armed security. Why do they have armed security, though? That seems like disproportionate. But like, what would be the... Because, I mean, listen, like, it's totally possible that they're overreacting, but like, I would imagine that the company wouldn't have armed security unless there was a need for it, especially in California. So I wonder if it was in like a very high crime area where there's a lot of, stuff going on. Is that why that happened?
That they're concerned about. Instead of dealing with the points being raised by activists, Walsh would sooner misrepresent them so he can say stuff like this.
Stealing isn't worth the cost of a human life.
True, I agree with that.
So don't steal.
Sure. Walsh then goes on to make a painfully simplistic argument about the need to defend property with lethal force, which includes anything you might get from a Walgreens. It's a very bad and silly point on the face of it. If you need a YouTuber to explain why someone shouldn't be executed on the spot for stealing a loaf of bread, or even, as Walsh at one point speculates, some fancy headphones, then you have a perspective on life that I don't think is going to be changed by a single YouTube video.
Maybe. I think that nobody should die over those things, but I also think that you shouldn't steal. Right? And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. No.
Here's some more criminal justice reform ideas from Walsh. This time it's regarding the death penalty for pedophiles.
Not only are we executing these people, but we're doing it quickly. We're not giving them 30 years to appeal, okay? The conviction is passed down, you're convicted, you're guilty, you've been found guilty, and then the execution is carried out the next day. Take them out to the gallows, you bring them up on the platform, you tie a rope around their neck, pull the lever, boom, it's done.
Walsh concocts this whole imaginary scenario.
Based? Listen, when it comes, first of all, there's a difference between a pedophile and a child molester, right? Somebody that's a pedophile isn't necessarily a child molester. We're going to get into that specifically, but it's obviously like a pretty big conversation. If you harm a child in any way, I tend to agree with Matt Walsh about that in this situation. Okay, let's just be clear. When it comes to the no appeal process, that might be an issue of like potentially, I guess you'd say, false imprisonment or something. There are people who go to jail who didn't necessarily do it, though, so you could argue about that. Again, against the death penalty is that argument of like, you know, there could be a false case, or the argument of like, you know, that means that somebody has to kill that person, and not everybody wants to be an executioner. However, when it comes to just the thought of like, you know, being a pedophile, like in the DSM-5, I don't people should deserve death for that. Nobody has control over that. Nobody wants to think about children. It's something that like ends up happening. It's wrong and it needs to be addressed. But if you say was kill pedophiles won't come forward and get the mental health help they need, which means that they are going to, that feeling is going to build in them, and they're going to end up molesting a child. And so, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, in order to help children, you need to provide mental health resources for people that have these urges to come forward and get help with those before they act on it. Or else they're just going to suppress it, and they're going to try to deal with it themselves, and then they're going to end up acting on it, and more children are going to get harmed. So, you know, I understand people not liking people who potentially harm children. Absolutely, I agree. But you need to put the way you feel aside if you want to prioritize the safety of children. So we need to get these individuals help before they act on their bad impulses. That's just what needs to be done. So,
scenario that I'm sure in his mind makes perfect sense. In the real world, though, death sentences are highly contested because many of them are overturned. For example, the Innocence Project specializes in overturning wrongful convictions through more modern investigative techniques, and many others sentenced to death have had those convictions overturned when new evidence is discovered. Walsh's fantasy leaves no room for that, and would mean innocent people would die. It also has this assumption that the justice system is perfect, which is just not true. Even on the point of a hanging being quick and effective, the reason hangings were stopped was because they often aren't. A botched hanging results in someone being slowly strangled to death. It's a struggle to describe Walsh's arguments as anything more than childish and lazy. He's very good at finding a way to never think deeply about any of the topics he covers. Why cite scientific research when you can simply make a reference to the science? Why honestly debate what activists are saying when you can create a simpler straw man to rail against instead? Why genuinely consider how the death penalty is applied when you can instead make up an imaginary scenario that is completely divorced from reality? Poor arguments framed by missing context aren't all his show is, though. He does devote a lot of time to creating bait. This is usually in the shape of having an over-the-top reaction about trivial things. For example, calling people savages if they let their pets sleep in the same bed.
Don't sleep with a dog in your bed, you savages.
He's got to be kidding there. It's just silly. That's just some silly goosery.
He also describes adults who like Disney World as mentally ill, and he hates bicycle lanes.
Are you serious, dude? Now you've got, Matt, the transphobia was one thing. But now you're going to call me out specifically? You've gone too far, sir. You've gone too far. That's all I have to say. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with being a Disney adult. My wife and I love Disney. Okay? Stop hate criming us. It's terrible.
It's here his commentary is more obviously laid bare, as the trolling it so often is. And what makes it effective is that it's hard to tell apart from his more serious commentary. They're similarly poorly argued and often based on Walsh's gut feelings about something. And he's needlessly confrontational about everything he says. It would be nice if he were just a silly guy we could afford to ignore, crying about people who let their pets sleep on the bed, using his pathetic bait to get media watchdogs and other commentators like myself to address him like he's someone worth considering. And if that was
yeah, it's hate farming. He's a hate farmer.
I wouldn't waste time talking about him in a video like this one. Instead, I think it's important to acknowledge this bait because it reflects the soft nature of all his news commentary, and there are aspects of that commentary that are genuinely harmful. The bait and the harmful commentary are similar in that none of it is very substantial, and whenever it approaches any subject that has any complexity whatsoever, for example, gender, all that nuance and complexity gets wiped away so Matt Walsh can comment on it at his own level. And as embarrassing as all of this is, the saddest part of the show is when he starts arguing with YouTube comments.
And at Accretionist says, yes, respecting LGBT people is difficult for you, and asking for that respect is brainwashing. We understand witless sadism, Matt. Well, I'm sure you do.
Or when he calls on his audience to harass Dwayne Wade.
Dwayne Wade, everywhere he goes, should be jeered and mocked.
Who the fuck is Dwayne
shouted
Wade?
at everywhere he goes. That should happen.
And there are so many other examples where Matt Walsh just seems...
I mean, that part is true, though, about like being anti-LGBTQ when it comes to Matt Walsh, and they just like people are like, oh, we just want basic respect. Because again, Matt Walsh got completely dumpstered by Joe Rogan on gay marriage. like completely dumpster. He didn't even know what to say. He drastically overstated the percentage of people that are trans. He's like, yeah, I think that there's like 1 million of them or something. He doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. That's how many people he thought like 100,000 people got trans surgeries 1 year, and he thinks that getting married is only about having kids. And that's it. He doesn't think it has anything to do with love or anything. He got dumpstered in that conversation with Joe Rogan. So
He's determined to come off as like this lecturing dad type, ready to put someone in their place. He desperately wants to be seen as some kind of tough guy or authority figure.
Tough guy,
but it's not very convincing, and it just reads as deeply insecure. Part of the problem of responding to a guy like this is it's very easy to get trapped in the endless corrections for all the lies he spreads, whether he's doing it knowingly or because he just doesn't understand. The one overriding impression, though, is that this guy is clearly not capable enough to be arguing in the position he's found himself in. The whole package of the Matt Walsh show is a sad one. He's a limited man desperate to present himself as some kind of powerful voice. It raises the important question of how did this...
That's true. I mean, when he got demonetized because he was being hateful in his anti-transness, it's fine. I mean, it's not fine to be anti-trans, but like it's fine if you have a perspective. But he was being hateful. He like went on to like a martyring thing about how like, oh, he's defending people, blah 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 blah. Like he's very self-righteous, and he thinks that he has like a very profoundly positive impact when he's just kind of like a baby yelling and screaming. So he does think quite highly of himself as some form of like anti-trans activist, for sure.
This guy become as successful as he is. First, we should probably ask, though, was he always this bad? In a lengthy expose put together by Media Matters, a series of old clips from 2010 to 2011 revealed some commentary from Matt Walsh that display some of his more extreme positions.
Girls between the ages of like 17 and 24 is when they're technically most fertile. Yeah. Okay? That's biological. That's a fact, all right? I'm just stating facts. That's all I'm doing. Every kid, ideally, should go to college and be career-minded. Right. Every single person. But that's just not the reality. And there's a lot of girls out there that don't want that, okay? That's not what they want. They want to get married at a young age, settle down, and start having a family. And up until about 1950, that was normal. And then we decided that's not okay anymore. Like, that's not going to help you be a good leader at a retail store, is that you have business, you learned about businesses because you read books about it. That's ridiculous.
When this story broke, some people were shocked by the content. And while it's certainly more...
Is that a fact that you're most fertile at 17? A woman's peak productive years are between the late teens and late 20s. I mean, maybe that's true. Maybe there's some truth to it. I could see why people would find that to be problematic, though. Okay. Thank you so much for the 6-month medium gut. 6 months. Let's go, baby. Question: do you think Matt actually cares about what he says, or do you think he's just in it for conservatives? I mean, I don't really know. I think a lot of it. I mean, I think that a lot of it's performative. I think that he gets off being like what people on the left do, like virtue bullying. I've been talking about that a lot. He looks at a situation that he feels is probably negative in some capacity, and then he sensationalizes it to use it as a justification to bully people that he thinks deserve to be bullied. That's why they'll make it about like, oh my God, they're hurting children when people are promoting like, safety for trans people. It's like, oh, they're hurting children, they're grooming children, because then you've turned them into groomers, and now you can safely virtue bully those people based on that intentionally false perspective when there's no child grooming going on. So like that's what really it boils down to me.
Mask off and his current stuff, you can see a lot of the patterns Walsh uses in the present day. In these old clips, he makes vague gestures to the past while being completely historically illiterate, and he's unable to engage with viewpoints that aren't his own. For example, in one of the longer clips, when he's making a point about teenage pregnancy and marriage, he has very poor responses to his co-host, who keeps raising the point of how difficult it is to avoid a family these days.
Yeah,
these days
true.
Being about 10 years ago. Not that it's gotten much better.
No,
Instead of actually engaging with this very valid point, Walsh goes on a rant about how college is useless and how people had the right idea 50 years ago, and that 16-year-olds are basically adults. None of that is true, and none of it addresses the point that's being raised about the economics of bringing up a family today, especially if we're talking about a pregnant teenager. Never mind the social, personal, and physical burdens as well. But that's how Matt Walsh engages in any sort of debate. He has a specific idea of how things work in his head, and he's not going to deviate from that, no matter what evidence you show him or what arguments you bring to his face. He has an opinion set in stone that's often simple and poorly informed, and he's not going to let anything change that. What these clips reveal is that Matt Walsh was making the same thoughtless, religiously tinted commentary throughout his career. This isn't a character he adopted a few years ago. This is just who this guy is. One of the keys to understanding this commentary is to know that Matt Walsh has a very specific kind of Christian worldview. He identifies as a Catholic, and through that faith he interprets the world around him. While not all Christians, or even all Catholics, would share Walsh's vision of Christianity, he has found common cause among other Christian conservatives who support his faith-based arguments. When Walsh starts discussing politics, it's through that Christian lens his worldview starts to make sense, specifically when he identifies liberalism as satanic. In his 2017 book, The Unholy Trinity, Blocking the Left's Assault on Life, Marriage, and Gender, it opens,
"The first liberal was named Lucifer."
He elaborates on this a bit later.
Bro, that's actually hilarious. The first liberal was named Lucifer. Incredible stuff, bro. Incredible.
They're writing,
Is the stream lagging at all or no?
Propelled all the great villains throughout history. It is the philosophy of Judas, of Nero, of Genghis Khan, of Adolf Hitler, of Hillary Clinton. The specifics of what these people all believed and how they framed it around political circumstances of the day isn't terribly relevant, for they desired the same thing and worshipped the same god, the self.
Walsh later claims that even the label of liberal or progressive are different reflections of that same deeper idea of self-worship, making this opposition to self-worship a very malleable thing. When Walsh writes about the political circumstances of the day not being terribly relevant, it's a convenient way of discarding any additional facts or circumstances that might complicate the point he's trying to make, a tactic you probably noticed earlier.
But we don't even need to talk about the science, which is all we really need to know about the case.
This is just Matt Walsh's move. Ignore nuance, ignore complexity or depth, reduce everything to a simple talking point, and move on from there. To the point where Nero, Adolf Hitler, and Hillary Clinton are basically the same villain. Walsh certainly isn't an originator of this idea of self-worship, and it's a charge that any non-believers will probably recognize. It's this move of defining you not by what you believe, but what someone else says you're missing. In this case, worship of the god Matt Walsh believes in. It's a way of taking someone's arguments and beliefs away from them and instead placing them into an easily shaped straw man that can be more easily dispatched.
A puppy? Well, that's the kind of straw man I'm looking for, is a cute puppy. But I don't really want like a puppy because I don't want to like clean it and feed it and stuff. So
it's a very lazy and dishonest way to frame somebody. And by the way, that god Matt Walsh believes in is not one shared by all Christians, at least according to him. In his 2020 book, Church of Cowards, A Wake-Up Call to Complacent Christians, he writes,
Today, around 70%.
Guys, complacent Christians are basically if you think that trans or gay people shouldn't be destroyed. That's what he thinks a complacent Christian is. If you're not morally outraged by people just trying to be their authentic selves, you are not the right kind of Christian, according to Matt Walsh. That's what it really boils down to.
Of Americans claim
be
to
more
Christian.
hateful.
This
be
number
less
represents
tolerant.
a marked decline, but the problem is not the decline in professed believers. If we had simply lost 10 or 20%, but still we had 70 who were really and truly on fire with the faith, there would be far less cause for concern. But the problem with the 70% is that it is not really 70%. The 70% is mostly composed of the sort of Christians who cannot be readily distinguished from atheists.
He then decries how Christians in America have become too permissive and don't take their faith seriously enough. The book even opens with
It's too many people becoming too accepting and tolerant. That's what he's saying.
a hypothetical scenario of a group of heathens invading America and being shocked to find out it isn't the Christian nation they thought it was. One of the big crises Walsh sees is the lack of Christianity in America, the type of Christianity he espouses, particularly on issues that animate him. The three causes he mentions in Unholy Trinity are abortion, gay marriage, and transgender people, and he believes any real Christian would oppose all three things. He comes across as very strident and firm in his faith, but it's interesting to contrast how hard Walsh is.
I mean, my thing is that if you're going to be that literal in the interpretation of the Bible to the point where you think that gay and trans people shouldn't be able to be valid or get married or anything, then you have to think slavery is okay. Like there's no debating that. Like it says it's okay in the Bible. It just does. It says you can have slaves and you're allowed to beat them as long as they don't die in like 2 days. It's a real thing, and you can't just go, oh, context, because there's no context that normalizes or allows that. So if you're going to interpret the Bible literally, you have to say that that's good. You can't be anti-slavery anymore. If you're going to be anti-LGBTQ, you have to be pro-slavery. That's just where it's at. That's just the fact of the matter.
Against Christians he thinks don't measure up, compared to when he speaks to Ben Shapiro about religion.
If you figure out how to love anyone outside of yourself during your life, then I think that's something God can take and work with. And those are little embers of something that he can ignite into fire in a good sense.
Some important context here is that Shapiro is Jewish and Matt Walsh's boss, and you can see Walsh's tone become much softer.
Because now he has to accept Ben Shapiro because he's Jewish, even though he's rallies against anybody who's not Christian, I suppose.
Mumbling something vague about loving other people and giving God something to work with. What he and Shapiro really share is that they happen to be fighting the same enemy. This is how alliances are often forged in right-wing spaces, particularly at right-wing media. It's not about what you fight for, it's about what you fight against. And it's not about what you believe, it's about what you hate. That's not really enough to explain why Matt Walsh's profile has risen to the point where he's more well-known than many other conservative commentary figures. While he's not at the level of Ben Shapiro or even Candace Owens, his name is probably more likely to be recognized.
Really? Is he not on Candace Owens' level? How prolific is Candace Owens? I feel like I see more Matt Walsh than Candace Owens. Maybe I'm just wrong about that. I guess I'm just racist. No. But really? Interesting.
Than Andrew Clavin or Jake Crane or 75% of the lineup of Glenn Beck's Blaze TV, Walsh's former home. Matt Walsh's broader success can be easily understood by comparing him to one of his Daily Wire colleagues, the somehow even less talented Michael Knowles.
True.
If anyone knows who Michael Knowles is, it's because of comments he made back at CPAC in March of 2023 when he called for the eradication of transgenderism.
Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. The whole preposterous ideology at every level.
Okay.
This statement is...
It's very inflammatory. It alludes to eliminating trans people is what it is. That's just the reality there. Jesus Christ.
A very clear example of getting as close as possible to calling for genocide without being explicit about it.
Yeah,
the implication
fair.
is clear, though, to remove trans people from public life. It raises the obvious question of what happens to the people who say being trans is a core part of their identity. The answer, at least looking at historical examples, tends to be murder or displacement. In other words, genocide. These comments are genocidal in character, even if they aren't an explicit call for genocide.
Sure.
The grotesque nature of these comments aside, what this briefly did was tell the world that Michael Knowles exists. Looking at the headlines for this story, we can see pretty clearly that...
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I don't think it's unrealistic to be like, oh, this is just like a hate farm. This is like, senpai, notice me. Notice me, senpai. Please notice who I am. It's me, Jessica. That is what it kind of reads as. Absolutely. As like an attempt to be in the public limelight and people to like know who you are. Especially trying to capitalize off of Matt Walsh, like being very hateful to trans people. That seems like, oh, it's working so well for Matt. Let me pretend to hate trans people more. You know, just be like most conservatives. I think it's like kind of strange, and then to be like, as long as they're not hurting anybody, you know what I mean? Just be like that person. That's it. There you go, and you're good. You're golden.
Most people weren't aware of who this guy was, even though he had been hosting a show for the Daily Wire since 2017.
And he was a gay guy in a movie once.
CPAC speaker calls for eradication of transgenderism, and somehow claims he's not calling for elimination of transgender people.
CPAC speaker sparks alarm with call for transgenderism.
Are these like fucking AI
eradicated.
readings? Like, what the hell?
CPAC speaker calls for eradication of transgenderism. Crowd goes wild.
As a fun aside, when I released my video on the Daily Wire's Terror on the Prairie, I put a black bar over Michael Knowles' face in the thumbnail to see if anyone would notice. I didn't see a single comment mention that. Okay. Michael Knowles has been trying to break through the noise of conservative commentary for years, and in spite of the financial resources behind him, he's had very little success.
This guy's like really going in on Michael Knowles, which I'm here for it, but it's kind of funny. Or person, I don't know. I don't know what Jose is. Maybe they're trans. I don't know. You don't know. Everything's. Yeah, man, it's kind of funny. So have they been putting like that much like financial investment into Michael Knowles to like the point where he's just like an emphatic failure that like is just using someone else's money to try to be popular? That's fucking wild.
The way he captured anyone's attention at all was to embrace genocidal rhetoric that had the thinnest layer of plausible deniability. This is how Matt Walsh did it too. Matt Walsh wasn't quite as brazen as Knowles, but he has similarly built a brand by demonizing trans people as much as possible. And looking at his history, we can see this has been an issue he's been passionate about for years. And as we saw in the commentary I highlighted earlier, Matt Walsh is not a sophisticated operator, but rather a true believer, so I don't think this is a simple grift. Instead, I think Matt Walsh is someone who is just lucky. To explain this, I have to zoom out a little bit, though. There's a helpful tool we'll need to understand called the Overton window. For those who are unfamiliar, that explains how political discourse exists on a spectrum that changes over time. What's left wing?
Like what's like? There's like a isn't that like what is acceptable to have political discussion about based on where we are societally? Am I right about that?
They can become right wing tomorrow and vice versa, depending on a population's general political leaning. The general political sentiments of a population are called the Overton window. Anything outside that window is considered extreme. So if we're talking about the United States, this can usually be split along party lines, though it's possible to be further to the left or right in either party and still be part of mainstream political discourse. But if you go too far, say being an anarchist or an open white nationalist, you fall right out of the Overton window and typically have your voice marginalized. This isn't a value judgment, by the way, just a statement of how this window works. Anarchists are cool and interesting people. White nationalists are scum, though, and I am judging them for being terrible. If I were to place Matt Walsh on the spectrum, we'd probably put him somewhere around here, particularly if we're talking about trans issues. And keep in mind, this is an image of commonly accepted political discourse, not personal feelings or subtext of the figure we're talking about. So dog whistles and masks, sadly, are in play, even if you're someone who can spot them. They work, and that's why people use them. And sadly, anti-trans rhetoric is broadly accepted on the right wing, so long as you aren't too obvious with the calls for genocide. You notice Matt Walsh is just on the side of acceptability when it comes to anti-trans rhetoric. We get pretty close to that line, making a lot of extreme statements, but he's savvy enough to couch it in a plausible deniability that keeps him from falling outside the Overton window of discourse. There are dozens of political commentators being bankrolled by millionaires and billionaires trying to influence the discourse. Most of them don't succeed.
Oh, yeah, like, what is it, like Charlie Kirk's thing? I forget what it's called. Whatever the fuck it's called, I forget. But it's bankrolled by, like, tons of money from, like, rich conservatives. This happens constantly, like, constantly dumping as much money into pushing political ideology, even if it's not financially satisfied, just to keep that, like, those ideas in flow. So.
Because their talking points don't animate people enough. There are lots of reasons for this, and it varies from person to person, but the short version is that their particular niche doesn't animate enough of the base. Matt Walsh happened upon the anti-trans discord with his What is a Woman movie. He'd been talking about trans people for years, but this key success made him the face of a major culture war issue. It's not just that he's anti-trans, but he's anti-trans in a way where he gets as close to the line as possible while appearing not to cross it. Matt Walsh's success exists entirely because of the moment he finds himself in, and getting very lucky with that movie. In this way, pushback against him ironically keeps him relevant. If the issue of trans people were a little more settled in people's minds, and anti-trans sentiment were more commonplace, he would lose relevance and no one would care about him. And if it were less hospitable to be anti-trans publicly, then he would be shunned as a pariah and would similarly lose his position.
Yeah,
he needs to be in this extreme position to have any sense of relevancy. And while he's relevant and popular, he can be used to animate the political base, which can be used to fuel political change. While the far right may not be in danger of going left, they sometimes need to be motivated to vote and organize for various causes, so they need to be riled up with hot-button issues. This is what makes Matt Walsh valuable in the right-wing media space. It's not the value of his commentary being transformative, it's that he happens to hate the right people at the right time in the right way that can be used to mobilize political change. Or at least, that's the assumption by the people who finance him. This is how Matt Walsh is useful. And just to be super clear, Matt Walsh didn't invent hating trans people, and in the grand scheme of things, his critiques are no more interesting or compelling than any other bigot. He just happened to come up with a catchy slogan for it. And he managed to stretch out that one glib question into a movie. And that's how someone can make a lucrative career, living just on the border of acceptable political discourse. In other words, Matt Walsh's immorality is incredibly lucky. Looking at the impact of anti-trans rhetoric, we can get a sense of the feelings Walsh is tapping into. Opinion polls regarding transgender people and trans issues varies quite a bit. In a recent Washington Post poll conducted with the KFF, they found anti-trans legislation was quite popular, particularly when it comes to certain types of gender-affirming care for trans kids. An excerpt from that article reads, nearly 7 in 10 adults said they oppose allowing children ages 10 to 14 access to medication that stops the body from going through puberty. And
yeah, I mean, I get that. I understand like the hesitance around that topic, especially for kids. So I understand that sentiment around that. The problem is that like it's not like Matt Walsh is like, oh, you know, whatever, adults do you, blah, blah, blah. He's against it in general. So it's one of those things where it's like a broken clock is right twice a day kind of a thing. And I wouldn't even say he's right. I think it's a very complicated topic that's worth talking about. But it's not like Matt Walsh is trans affirming, generally speaking. But when it comes to kids, it's like, okay, this is a hot button issue, or this is like a tough spot. It's a little difficult to navigate. It's just that he is transphobic and will always just say trans no. And so in this instance with kids, it's going to be more virtue signaling about, you know, how dangerous it is for kids when, like, you know, frankly, there are things that are more dangerous to kids. And like, I'm not trying to be rude and not trying to like call conservatives out, but like religion is dangerous to kids. I don't want to, in some instances, there is objectively more danger associated with religion than there is with being LGBTQ. I don't know what to tell you. There's kids that were like, you know, abused in religious spaces, molested, and it was covered up by religious institutions. That is a thing that's happened. That is a fact. We understand that there are some ways that it can make you hate who you are as a person so much that it can engage in like incredible amounts of like personal distress. You know, not a lot, like gay kids exist, and so like telling like religious spaces that are like gay is bad, that distresses gay kids out and makes them feel like incredibly inadequate and gives them, I would say, like very intense anxiety and depression and things along those lines. There are instances in very traditional areas where instead of going to the police or going to a therapist, you go to your priest or you go to like one of like a religious counselor, and they don't know how to properly deal with particular issues of different forms of abuse. I mean, look at the Duggard family. That's an incredible example of like, you know, a fucked up situation where there was like one of their children was molesting their other kids, and instead of bringing them to a mental health person that focuses on mental health to help correct the behavior when they were young, they brought the kid to like a religious counselor, and now he's looking at horrible, disgusting images about children, which could have potentially been avoided if they had just gone to an actual mental health counselor that could have properly dealt with that issue. Because if you're a young kid, if you're like, 10 or 12 years old and you're engaging in those behaviors, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have predatory tendencies. It could mean a whole host of other behavioral issues that are very delicate and need to be properly addressed by a therapist. Most of it's behavioral issues, I would say, and part of that can come from like sexual repression of like shaming kids for any type of sexual feeling, because again, in religious spaces they teach abstinence instead of actual decent sexual health education. it's a very complicated topic with a lot of these things, but like that's much more harmful for a kid than like, oh, you can love a boy or a girl if you're a boy or a girl. That's much more dangerous and toxic and abuse ridden. Religion is more prone to, kids are more prone to abuse in religion than they are in LGBTQ spaces, 1,000%. So
nearly 6 in 10 oppose giving 15 to 17-year-olds access to hormone therapy. There was, however, majority support for gender-affirming counseling or therapy, with more than 6 in 10 supporting this for both age groups. But looking at other polling, for instance, a poll conducted by PBS NewsHour shows different results. In this case, the question being asked is, do you support legislation that criminalizes providing gender-affirming care for minors? The results in this poll was that 54%.
I would say no, not criminalizing. Like, listen, at the end of the day, I'm uncomfortable with it, but there are mental health counselors who deal with this kind of shit, and they know better than me, right? So, like, hey, listen, I just want to make sure people are happy. That's all I care about. Dude, the fact that I keep getting immobilized is so frustrating. Holy fuck.
Opposed the bans, while 43% supported them. This comparison was made in an article for The Stranger by Alex Corin, a journalist and researcher on transphobia. She highlighted how this poll from the post-NKFF suffers from issues similar to polls on abortion, how questions are asked on polls matter and results shift accordingly. She brings up another point of comparison. In a Mason-Dixon poll in Kentucky, there was an even more pronounced result when it was asked, would you support or oppose a proposed Kentucky law that would allow the state to overrule parents' decision to obtain certain health care for their transgender teenager, such as certain medications that can regulate the onset of puberty? In this case, 71% opposed the legislation and 21% supported it. As Corin describes in her article, rather than just throw certain polls out and hold up the ones we want, looking at all of this information reveals to us that what matters to people is who decides in these issues. While people may oppose certain types of gender-affirming care personally, that does not necessarily reveal any desire for the state to intervene and prevent parents from deciding what's best for their child. And there are still more.
Do you support your kids doing the thug shaker? That's the poll that I'm worried about. Do you support your kid doing the thug shaker?
More polls that reveal a general fatigue over trans issues being emphasized in political discourse. Here's an excerpt from the website Roll Call about one recent poll from Data for Progress. When asked about the more than 400 pieces of legislation working their way through state houses aimed at limiting the rights of transgender and gay people in America, 64% of respondents, including 55% of Republicans, sided with the statement, "This is too much legislation, politicians are playing political theater, and using these bills as a wedge issue," compared with 25% who agreed with the statement, "This is the right amount of legislation, politicians are dealing with a real danger that needs to be addressed." This figure rose to 78% among respondents who know a transgender person.
Wow, it's interesting. But they're saying that a lot of people actually think that there's too much legislation that's surrounding political issues. There are currently 429 bills passing through the state legislature and limiting the rights of trans and gay people in America. Which statement comes closer to your own view? There is too much legislation. Politicians are playing political theater and using these bills. Okay. Wow, a lot of people know a trans person. Doesn't know a trans person. Interesting. Okay.
And that last part is especially interesting because just knowing a transgender person seems to have a dramatic impact in all polling for supporting transgender people in general.
Absolutely. I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. That's why people need to go and meet people. I would say that people that have gay and trans family are more likely to be gay and trans affirming because they're like, oh, I know somebody, and they're good people because they're people first. That's the fundamental reason that we engage in like people first language. People always criticize it and they say it's like, oh, it's cringe, like saying people of color is cringe, or like a person with a disability rather than a disabled person, right? The fundamental idea is to be person first. It's to centralize that they are a person before they are their identity, because it's different. It's harder to dehumanize somebody once they're a somebody to you, right? And that's very important. That's why you should get to know people in different communities. You have get a black friend, get a white friend. We're very oppressed. Get like a gay friend, a trans friend, a friend that's in the IDD community. You know, have different friends so that you can express these different ideas, or that you can understand them, because humanization comes before anything else. And if you can humanize somebody, like, it becomes a much better thing. So,
and also underscores the importance of representation. Seeing who these people are and the struggles they go with creates greater degrees of sympathy and support. Other results show that the younger generation is generally pro-trans rights, with some predicting a massive change on the topic within 10 years. All that said, it's also true that many people are still ignorant regarding trans issues and remain susceptible to messengers like Walsh. That's part of what makes him particularly valuable. One funny thing I noticed while watching Matt Walsh was he often fought back against other figures on the right when they would criticize an emphasis on the culture wars.
Okay, understand this. If you are doing this whole focus on the economy, not the culture war thing, you are repeating the same talking point that the GOP establishment has used for 40 years. is because the Republican Party...
If the GOP has been saying stop focusing on like the culture war and start focusing on actual policy, maybe you dumb motherfuckers should have listened. Because it's a fact. Like, you're losing your own conservative base when you constantly talk about these issues over and over again. It's not like people are like, hey, trans people. Hey, what about those trans people? What about airline peanuts? But also, what about these other issues? It's just gay and trans people, and it's annoying. It's turning people away from the party because, like, most people in the conservative sphere, I would say, just don't care about trans people. They're more interested in, like, what can you do to benefit me? It's kind of a human thought to engage in, like, well, what about me? What about my issues? Why are we so obsessed with, like, trans people? So, like, that's why you're losing people's in general. That's why the sentiment about conservatives has shifted, I think, drastically. Over the years, it's like, what the fuck is going on? What are you doing? Like, when you're sitting here shitting on trans people and like siding with Russia in the war with Ukraine, I mean, I'm just like, who are you conservatives? What happened to like America #1? All of a sudden, oh, Russia's so much better because they don't allow gay people rights and they are colonizing they're trying to steal Ukraine. Somehow this is, I don't know, good. I don't even know what to say. It's interesting. It's interesting stuff.
We're supposed to be ostensibly the leaders of the conservative movement. For decades now, they've been saying, the culture doesn't matter. All that matters is the economy and foreign policy. Let's worry about that. And so they surrendered the culture to the left, and now here we are.
The defensiveness and lack of
at the low point, you guys won't stop obsessing about culture, so I don't even know if that argument makes sense.
Historical literacy here is pretty funny. The right has been harping about culture war issues for decades. They brought them up with gay marriage, prayer in school, and all sorts of religiously themed topics I would assume Matt Walsh would know something about. Obviously, what Matt Walsh is concerned with here is sliding into political irrelevance. Without the culture wars, and specifically anti-trans rhetoric,
True. That's Matt Walsh's whole shtick. If society wasn't obsessed with trans and gay issues, Matt Walsh would lose everything. I didn't even think of it like that. That's a good point. But if we don't talk about trans issues, Matt Walsh loses his platform because there's nothing else that he can have intelligent conversations about. I mean, this guy, when he tried to talk about, when he was trying to talk about like the way that we interacted with historically when it comes to colonization, he talked about how like in slavery, he's like, oh, it was kind of a good thing though if you think about it. It's like, no, that's not the way that you have that discourse. It's very clear that he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. Because I got what he was saying, like, hey, if things didn't happen this way, then you black people wouldn't be here, so that would be bad. If anything, slavery is good. No. The reality is we have a tragic past and we can only move forward, right? And I understand that. But to sit here and be like, yo, if I could change things, I wouldn't, because it was worth it. Like, I don't think it was worth it to black people to be enslaved and tortured and abused and raped in instances as well, and forcefully bred with each other. That's not a good thing. But that's the way that he engages with discourse. It's fucking incredible stuff.
Care about what this guy has to say, so he has to cling on to it for dear life. But the reason there's a pushback against culture war issues by the right, at least when it comes to trans issues, is that it's a very poor political performer. In a Substack post from a user named Etingermentum titled The Modern Electoral History of Transphobia, we get a lengthy breakdown on how many times transphobia has failed at the ballot box in the United States, most recently in the 2022 midterm elections. What much of the polling highlighted early in this video fails to capture, and something I wish people would understand broadly about any opinion poll, is that just because someone feels a way about an issue doesn't mean that that issue will influence how they vote, or how they'll even politically organize. For example, if ketchup had a 90% approval rating and a politician said they were going to ban it, it probably wouldn't influence the election if voters
if you were talking about something else, like mustard, that would be fine. But you're talking about banning ketchup, bro. I would absolutely riot over banning ketchup. You're done. You're done. You're fucking done. Not my ketchup. But I say it weird, ketchup. Ketchup? Ketchup? How do you say I don't care.
That same politician had a plan that would revitalize the economy for working people. Issues like the economy are far more important in elections than what you put on your french fries.
That makes
sense. But that speaks to something that Etingermentum brings up in their article. Here's an excerpt.
While general public apathy towards the issue means that voters are exceedingly unlikely to vote for Republicans because of anti-trans messaging, as has been extensively demonstrated, it also means that politicians who pass anti-trans laws are not likely to face significant electoral pushback over it.
And that would explain why so many anti-trans laws are being passed in red states with limited pushback. People are generally not motivated by transphobia, whether it's to take part in the transphobia or to stand against it. And while that's great for the former, it's tragic for the latter. These are issues that people should want to take a stand for, to stand up for the humanity of people. And the saddest part of these polls are the people who just seem willing to not care. And so even if someone like Matt Walsh has limited appeal, it's important for people to know what sort of hate a ghoul like this is spreading, because even if it won't swing a federal election,
ghoul?
it's still something that impacts any transgender person living in a red state, or any transgender person more broadly who's been a victim of harassment or a hate crime. If anti-trans legislation isn't going to move the needle electorally, it does raise the question of why do it at all? And the answer seems to be, according to Ad Incrementum, is that some of these people are just true believers. Here's another excerpt from the article.
Much like the old demographics as destiny theory that captured the Democratic Party in the 2000s and 2010s, anti-trans, or more broadly, anti-woke lore is the right kind of story for the right political class at just the right time.
I swear I thought of using that phrase to describe Matt Walsh before reading this article, but it does speak to how his success really is a product of very fortunate timing. And while a lot of this is being presented in this video as how it impacts electoral politics, I do want to stress there are many other real threats impacting transgender people outside of legislation. The frightening number of hate crimes, including murder, is fostered by anti-trans rhetoric spread by the likes of Walsh. I'm not entirely sure he's savvy enough to be aware that his hobby horse has no real electoral heft. But if he is, that's even worse, because instead of being a willing tool of the right-wing media ecosystem that serves as a PR wing for the Republican Party, he's instead using this platform he's lucked into to make as much money as he can, while spreading hatred that actively harms transgender people. There is a bit of a silver lining here in that one-trick ponies rarely have any staying power. While transphobia will be a long-term struggle, the fight against mediocre bigots like Matt Walsh probably won't be as long. So the whole point of this video, I guess, is to remind everyone that the fight for trans rights is about more than this guy.
Is this guy saying that, like, in 5 years, people will be telling Matt Walsh that he fell off and he'll be, like, screaming, "Oh, I didn't fall off. I didn't fucking fall off. Fuck you." Is that what we're going to hear? So is that what it's going to be?
And while it's important to oppose him, the real problem is the moment we find ourselves in, when trans people are continuously under threat. Going back to the point I mentioned earlier, most people aren't motivated by trans issues. Not caring is perfectly fine in a better world. Letting people live how they choose without making your business is a very good and valid position.
As long as it's between consenting adults, of course, right? Like, I know what he's means that. I just want to be clear there for any weirdos watching this.
But right now we live in a world that's hostile to trans people, and that threat is multiplied for a number of intersectional identities. So it's not just trans men and trans women who are under threat, but also non-binary people, transgender people who are POCs or have disabilities, or just any transgender person who might need somebody to fight alongside them. So I guess the message I hope you all take away from this is that when fighting for the rights of others, it's less about fighting against a certain man and more about fighting in a certain moment. A big thanks to all the trans creators who lended their voice to this video. I hope you all check out their
I thought that those people were AI. Not to be rude or anything. I thought that was all AI or something. I thought that was like an AI thing. I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, weird. But I guess that was trans people.
Channels listed below. Once upon a time, I told myself I would never...
Oh my God, at this point, you should just debate Matt Walsh. Let me just go talk to this guy with 2 million followers. I'm sure he'll debate me. If he wasn't going to debate Hunter Avalon, he's not going to debate me. But
make a video discussing Matt Walsh because he is so boring and untalented and inconsequential. Sadly, things have changed to the point where he actually is worth some attention and some pushback. Hopefully this video contextualized him in a way that reveals he's not so big and scary as he poses. He's just a lucky dude who happened upon a lucrative career hating the right people. That's something to keep in mind for others of his ilk in the future. Although if a year from now I find myself making a video about Michael Knowles, someone get a wellness check ready because I will be very, very sad that I have to even discuss that loser. If you would like to support me, consider joining my Patreon. You'll get lots of fun bonuses, including early access to videos, your name in the credits, and other neat stuff that I come up with every now and again. And if you would like to support this channel in a non-monetary fashion, you could like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. Boom. And if you need an idea for comment below, how about...
All right. Good video. I enjoyed it.